Princess Lyra stood on the balcony of her palace, overlooking the beautiful city of Zenthara. The twin moons shone brightly in the sky, casting a gentle glow over the silver towers and bustling streets below. She had always loved this view. It made her feel safe, like nothing bad could ever happen to her in the heart of the Zenthari Empire. But tonight was different. A cold wind blew through the palace, carrying whispers of danger. Deep in her heart, Lyra felt uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. The Zenthari Empire had been peaceful for years. Her people were strong, and their technology was the most advanced in the galaxy. What could possibly go wrong? Just as she was about to return to her chambers, she heard the sound of alarms ringing through the palace. The loud, shrill noise echoed in the night air, making her heart race. She rushed back inside, her silk gown flowing behind her. Guards were running through the hallways, shouting orders. "What's happening?" Lyra asked one of the guards, her voice trembling. "Princess, you must go to safety immediately. Warlord Zarkon's forces are attacking," the guard replied, his eyes wide with fear. Lyra's heart sank. Zarkon, the ruthless warlord who had terrorized neighboring planets for years, was now attacking her home. She had heard stories about him, about his cruelty, his thirst for power, and how he destroyed entire civilizations without mercy. But she never thought he would dare attack the mighty Zenthari. Before she could say another word, an explosion rocked the palace. The ground shook beneath her feet, and the sound of blaster fire echoed through the halls. Lyra turned and ran, fear gripping her chest. She had to get to the safe room, the one place where she might be protected from Zarkon's forces. As she ran, a group of Zenthari soldiers appeared at her side, guiding her through the palace. But they didn't get far. A squad of Zarkon's soldiers, tall and menacing in their black armor, stormed through the entrance, blasting anyone who stood in their way. The Zenthari soldiers fought bravely, but they were no match for the invaders. Lyra's eyes filled with tears as she watched her people fall one by one. She wanted to help, but she was unarmed and powerless. "Princess, we must go now!" one of her guards shouted, pulling her down a side corridor. But before they could escape, more of Zarkon's soldiers appeared, cutting off their path. Lyra froze. There was nowhere left to run. The leader of the enemy soldiers, a tall figure with glowing red eyes, stepped forward. His voice was cold and cruel as he spoke. "Princess Lyra of the Zenthari Empire," he said. "You are coming with us." Lyra backed away, but there was no escape. The enemy soldiers surrounded her, their weapons raised. Her last guard tried to fight them off, but he was quickly overpowered. The leader grabbed Lyra's arm roughly, pulling her towards the waiting ship outside the palace. "Let me go!" Lyra shouted, struggling against his grip. But it was no use. She was dragged onto the ship as the palace burned behind her. The once beautiful city of Zenthara was in chaos, its people screaming as Zarkon's forces tore through the streets. As the ship's door closed behind her, Lyra felt a deep sense of helplessness. Her people wouldn't be able to save her. The Zenthari Council would never risk a war with Zarkon. She was truly alone. And so, Princess Lyra, the shining star of the Zenthari Empire, was taken away by Zarkon's forces, her future uncertain. Jake sat in the small bar on the dusty planet of Cora 5, staring at the holoscreen in front of him. The news of Princess Lyra's kidnapping was all over the galaxy. Everyone was talking about how Warlord Zarkon had taken her and how the Zenthari Council was too afraid to rescue her. "They're just going to leave her with that monster," one alien muttered at the bar next to Jake. "No one's brave enough to stand up to Zarkon." Jake listened quietly, sipping his drink. He wasn't a soldier, not anymore. He had fought in wars, he had seen his friends die, and he had tried to leave that life behind. But something about this situation didn't sit right with him. A young princess, all alone in the hands of a ruthless warlord, and no one was going to do anything? It made his blood boil. As the bartender switched the channel, Jake leaned back in his chair, thinking. He couldn't just sit here and do nothing. No one else was going to save Princess Lyra. Maybe it was time for a human to step up. Jake wasn't famous. He wasn't rich. He was just a man who knew how to fight and had a good heart. But that was enough. He decided right then and there that he was going to rescue the princess, even if it meant facing Zarkon's entire army. First, though, he needed a team. He couldn't do this alone. He knew a few people who might help him, people who weren't afraid of danger. There was Rax, an alien pilot who owed Jake a favor, and Kira, an old warrior who had fought in many battles but had been retired for years. Both were tough, and Jake trusted them with his life. Jake quickly made contact with Rax, finding him in a rundown hangar near the bar. Rax was a short, blue-skinned alien with sharp eyes and quick hands. His ship, the Starstrike, might not look like much, but it was fast, and Rax was the best pilot Jake knew. "You're crazy, Jake," Rax said when Jake explained the plan. "You want to take on Zarkon? Do you have a death wish?" Jake smiled. "Maybe, but I need your help. I can't do this without you." Rax sighed but nodded. "All right, count me in, but don't say I didn't warn you." Next, Jake went to see Kira. She lived in a quiet village on a peaceful planet, far away from the violence of the galaxy. When Jake knocked on her door, she was surprised to see him. "Jake," she said with a frown, "I thought you were done with fighting." "I was," Jake replied. "But this is different. The Zenthari princess has been taken by Zarkon. No one is going to save her. I have to try." Kira looked at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "You always had more guts than sense. I'll come. But if we're doing this, we do it smart. No rushing in like fools." With Rax and Kira on his side, Jake felt more confident. They had the skills, the ship, and the plan. The three of them spent the next few days preparing. They gathered supplies, weapons, and made sure the Starstrike was in top condition. The plan was simple: sneak into Zarkon's territory, find out where Princess Lyra was being held, and rescue her. It wouldn't be easy, but Jake had faced worse odds before. He knew that if they worked together, they could pull it off. As they boarded the ship and prepared to take off, Jake looked out at the stars. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let fear stop him. "Let's go save a princess," Jake said. And with that, the Starstrike blasted off into the unknown, heading straight into danger. The Starstrike flew silently through the cold, dark space of Zarkon's territory. Jake, Rax, and Kira sat in the cockpit, their eyes fixed on the massive fortress in the distance. It was Zarkon's stronghold, hidden on a barren, rocky planet surrounded by defense ships and deadly turrets. The fortress looked like a metal beast with its sharp towers and glowing red lights. "We're getting close," Rax whispered, his fingers dancing over the controls. "I'm going to activate the stealth mode. If they spot us, we're dead." Jake nodded, gripping his blaster tightly. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The plan was dangerous, but it was their only chance to rescue Princess Lyra. "Remember," Kira said, her voice steady, "we're not here for a fight. We sneak in, get the princess, and get out. If we run into trouble, don't hesitate. We can't win against Zarkon's army." Jake and Rax exchanged glances. They both knew how risky this mission was. Zarkon's soldiers were some of the most dangerous in the galaxy, and his fortress was built to keep intruders out. But they had no other option. Princess Lyra's life was at stake, and Jake wasn't about to let her down. As the Starstrike approached the fortress, Rax expertly guided the ship through a gap in the patrols. The ship moved like a shadow, slipping past the enemy defenses unnoticed. Jake held his breath, waiting for the alarm to sound. But it never came. "We're in," Rax whispered, landing the ship behind a large, jagged rock near the fortress. "This is as close as I can get without them spotting us. We'll have to go the rest of the way on foot." Jake, Kira, and Rax grabbed their weapons and stepped out of the ship, moving quickly towards the fortress. The air was cold, and the ground beneath them was rough and cracked. In the distance, the fortress loomed like a giant, its walls guarded by soldiers and automated turrets. Kira led the way, her movements silent and precise. She had been in more dangerous situations than Jake could count, and he trusted her instincts completely. They reached a side entrance hidden behind a cluster of rocks. Kira examined the door, then pulled out a small device and hacked into the lock. "Got it," she whispered, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. The three of them slipped inside, entering a dimly lit hallway. The air inside the fortress was thick and stale. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the halls as Zarkon's soldiers patrolled the area. Jake's pulse quickened, but he stayed focused. They couldn't afford any mistakes. They moved through the hallways, sticking to the shadows. Every time they heard soldiers approaching, they hid behind pillars or ducked into empty rooms. Jake could feel the tension building. They were getting closer to the princess, but so far, no one had noticed them. It was almost too easy. Finally, they reached the lower level of the fortress where Princess Lyra was being held. There they found a large cell guarded by 2 soldiers. Jake nodded to Kira, and without a word, she leaped into action. In seconds, the guards were knocked out cold. Jake rushed to the cell and saw Princess Lyra inside. She looked tired but unharmed. Her eyes widened when she saw Jake. "You came for me?" she whispered, disbelief in her voice. Jake smiled and unlocked the cell. "I told you I would." But before they could celebrate, a loud alarm suddenly blared through the fortress. Red lights flashed, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the halls. "They know we're here," Rax said, his voice tight with fear. "We have to move. Now!" Jake grabbed Lyra's hand. "Let's go. We're not leaving without you." With soldiers closing in, they sprinted back toward the exit, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. Alarms blared through Zarkon's fortress as Jake, Rax, Kira, and Princess Lyra ran down the dimly lit hallways. Red lights flashed on the walls, and the sound of soldiers shouting orders filled the air. Jake could feel the ground vibrating beneath his feet as Zarkon's army began to close in. "We're running out of time!" Rax shouted, glancing over his shoulder. "They'll cut us off if we don't move faster." Jake tightened his grip on Lyra's hand. She was struggling to keep up, but she didn't complain. The princess had more courage than most people Jake had fought beside. He admired her strength, but he knew they had to move quicker if they wanted to survive. Kira, always the calm one in a crisis, led the way. She had already memorized the layout of the fortress and knew the quickest route back to the Star Strike. But getting there wasn't going to be easy. Soldiers were already flooding the hallways, and the exit was heavily guarded. "Take the left corridor!" Kira barked, her eyes scanning the path ahead. "It's longer, but we can avoid the main patrols." They turned sharply into a narrow corridor. The walls were damp, and the air was thick with the smell of metal and fuel. Jake could hear the heavy footsteps of Zarkon's soldiers getting closer. There wasn't much time left. Suddenly, a group of soldiers appeared at the far end of the corridor, their blasters aimed straight at Jake and his team. "Down!" Jake yelled, pulling Lyra to the ground as laser shots flew past them, hitting the walls with a loud zap. Kira didn't hesitate. She charged forward, her combat skills on full display. With quick, precise movements, she disarmed the nearest soldier and took him down with a swift punch. Rax joined the fight, using his blaster to hold off the rest of the guards. "Go! I'll cover you!" Rax shouted, firing at the soldiers. Jake nodded and helped Lyra to her feet. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice urgent. "Rax will catch up." They sprinted down another hallway, this one leading to the docking bay where the Star Strike was hidden. But as they turned the corner, more soldiers appeared, blocking their path. Jake's heart raced as he realized they were trapped. Kira's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. "There!" she said, pointing to a small maintenance shaft. "It's a tight fit, but we can crawl through it to the other side." Without wasting any time, Jake helped Lyra into the shaft. The metal was cold against their skin as they crawled through the narrow space, the sound of soldiers chasing them fading slightly. It was dark inside the shaft, but Jake could hear Kira breathing behind him, her movement steady and focused. After what felt like hours, they reached the end of the shaft and emerged into the docking bay. The Star Strike was waiting for them just a few meters away. "We made it," Jake said, feeling a surge of relief. But that relief was short-lived. More alarms went off, and a group of elite soldiers, bigger and more armored than the ones they had faced before, stormed into the docking bay. "Get to the ship," Kira ordered, drawing her weapon. "I'll hold them off." "No," Jake protested. "We all leave together." Kira shook her head. "Someone has to keep them busy, or none of us will make it." "Go, Jake. Protect the princess." Jake hesitated, but knew she was right. With a heavy heart, he grabbed Lyra's hand and ran toward the Star Strike, his heart pounding as the soldiers fired at them. The ship's door slid open and they rushed inside. "Rax, start the engines!" Jake shouted. The Star Strike roared to life, and as the ship lifted off the ground, Jake watched through the window as Kira fought bravely against the soldiers. The last thing he saw before they blasted into the sky was Kira taking down 3 more enemies before being surrounded. The ship shot through the atmosphere, escaping Zarkon's planet. But Jake's heart was heavy with the loss of his friend. "We'll come back for her," Lyra whispered, sensing his pain. Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. We will, but first we need to make sure you're safe. The Starstrike disappeared into space, leaving the fortress behind, but Jake knew the fight was far from over. The Starstrike sped through the blackness of space, heading towards the nearest safe zone. Jake sat in the cockpit, staring out at the stars, his mind still on the battle they had just escaped. Princess Lyra sat beside him, her face pale but determined. She hadn't said much since they left, and Jake knew she was thinking about Kira, just like he was. We'll go back for her, Lyra said softly, breaking the silence. We can't leave her behind. Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. We will, but we need to plan first. Zarkon's fortress is too well guarded. We'll need reinforcements. Rax, who had been silent during the flight, finally spoke up. I know a place. There's a rebel group not far from here. They've been fighting Zarkon for years. If anyone can help us, it's them. Jake turned to him. Do you trust them? Rax shrugged. As much as I trust anyone in this galaxy. But they hate Zarkon as much as we do. That's good enough for me. With a new plan forming, Jake set the coordinates and the Starstrike changed course. Time was running out for Kira, and they couldn't afford to waste a single second. After a tense flight, they reached the rebel base, a hidden outpost on a remote asteroid. The base was small but well fortified, with a fleet of battered ships and soldiers preparing for battle. The leader of the rebels, Captain Mira, greeted them with a stern expression. We've heard of your fight with Zarkon, Mira said, but rescuing one person from his fortress is suicide. Jake stepped forward, his voice firm. We've already made it inside once. We just need your help to finish the job. Mira studied him for a moment before nodding. You've got guts, human. We'll help you. But don't expect this to be easy. Within hours, the rebels were ready. A small fleet of ships, including the Starstrike, launched into space, heading straight for Zarkon's fortress. The plan was simple. The rebels would attack the outer defenses while Jake, Rax, and Lyra went inside to rescue Kira. The battle began the moment they entered Zarkon's territory. Explosions lit up the sky as the rebel ships engaged Zarkon's fleet. The fortress fired back with everything it had, but the rebels were fast and determined. The Starstrike slipped through the chaos, heading straight for the fortress. Inside the fortress, Jake, Rax, and Lyra moved quickly. They knew time was running out for Kira. The hallways were filled with soldiers, but this time they were ready. With the rebels causing a distraction outside, most of Zarkon's forces were busy defending the fortress. Jake led the way, taking down guards with precision as they moved deeper into the stronghold. Finally, they reached the prison block where Kira was being held. She was bruised and tired, but her eyes lit up when she saw them. You came back, Kira said, a small smile forming on her lips. Jake grinned. We never leave our friends behind. With Kira freed, they raced back towards the Starstrike, but Zarkon himself was waiting for them at the exit. His massive figure blocked the doorway, and his eyes burned with anger. You think you can defeat me, human? Zarkon growled, raising his blaster. You're nothing compared to me. Jake stood tall, meeting Zarkon's gaze without fear. Maybe I'm not, but we're not alone. Before Zarkon could fire, a barrage of laser shots blasted through the door. The rebel fleet had arrived, and Zarkon's forces were falling back. The fortress was crumbling, and Zarkon knew he had lost. This isn't over! Zarkon roared as he fled into the shadows. Jake didn't waste a second. He and the others rushed onto the Starstrike and took off as the fortress exploded behind them, sending debris into space.